traveler, who arrives at the hill town of Guardia Piemontese, and looks down towards the coast from the terrace of the convent district, will admire an enchanting panorama, which stretches from the blue sea to the green mountains. Turning his gaze to the east, he will see a group of houses in the distance, which straggle like a flock of sheep towards the shore. This is Fuscoldo, which, built on a hill, still preserves the ruins of Prince Salvator Spinelli's castle, the one-time lord of the estates of Guardia, Fuscoldo and Bola. From the balcony of that castle, on the night of June the 5th, 1561, Spinelli waited anxiously to see tongues of fire light up the sky above Guardia, which would confirm the success of his foul trap. But why such a ferocious attack against a village inhabited for more than 3 centuries by a peaceful Waldensian community? The name Waldensians comes from Wildo of Lan, a rich merchant, who could barely read or write, but knew the books of the Old and New Testaments by heart. Having given away all his possessions to the poor, he began to preach, to explain the Bible which he had translated into the vernacular, and to live a life closer to that of the Gospels. His followers, known as the Poor Men of Lyon, as did Francesco's Poor Men of Assisi, later inspired by the message of the Gospel, prayed, worked, did not store up riches, and lived their lives in such a way as not to cause scandal but to be an example. Mapp, an English clergyman, described them thus: "These people do not own their own homes. They travel round in pairs, barefooted, with no luggage, sharing everything they have, following the example of the apostles. Pope Alexander 111, during the Third Lateran Council, in 1179, approved their way of life. But when the Waldensians refused to give up their lay preaching of the Bible, they were excommunicated by Lucian 111, in 1181. Thus began the repression and dispersion of the Waldensians, who left France to escape persecution and fled throughout Europe, preferring the valleys and mountains of Piedmont and other regions, where the land was uncultivated or abandoned and needed farm hands to work there. It was under the reign of Charles of Anjou, 1226 to 1285, that Zanina del Poggio, a Milanese, named Lord of Fuscoldo for his prowess in war, invited the Waldensians to move to his land in Calabria. They went, and having agreed on a rent were able to carry out their activities, based mainly on agriculture and sheep farming. Their lives were governed by the feudal lord, who dominated the land, by their Provençal language, which was incomprehensible to their neighbors, and by their care not to practice their religion openly. For more than 3 centuries, they lived unobserved in simple houses, built close together in narrow streets and alleys, keeping up their traditions. They got on well with the clergy, to whom they paid their tithes. From time to time they went to Mass, and celebrated funerals, baptisms and weddings, occasions for festivity for the whole community.
In 1348, Europe, struck by the epidemic of the Black Death, Boccaccio writes about it in the Decameron. In a little less than 5 years lost a third of its population. About 30 million people. Large areas of the countryside were abandoned and invaded by natural vegetation or by malaria. It wasn't until the middle of the 400s that the population began to grow again. Uncultivated or abandoned land was reoccupied and commercial and manufacturing activities began to function again. Among the various crops, those which produced fibers were preferred, such as flax, hemp, broom or mulberry for silkworms. On the Calabrian Tyrrhenian coast, there was a lot of activity in the ports of Pola and Straro. Boats set out for European markets, with agricultural and products produced by craftsmen, wood and pitch, and besides these goods, as some legal documents declare, migrant Waldensians from the south of France also set sail. Also in Guardian, the favorable economic conditions have allowed some inhabitants to abandon pastoralism and agriculture to become weavers, spinners and bakers. Many had entered the church to gain financial advantages, tax relief and personal immunity. Most priests were either married or living with concubines, and so in 1469, a law was enforced, which imposed the payment of taxes by all priests of dubious morality. There was a bishop in Switzerland, who fined the priests in his diocese, who had concubines. They had to pay 4 florins for every illegitimate child they had brought into the world. In 1 year he collected more than 1,500 florins. Again, in 1568, Francesco della Lava, ambassador to the French king, Philip II, wrote about an entire village who complained about their priest and asked the archbishop to either remove him or permit him to get married, since all the newborn babies were born with his blue eyes. Ecclesiastical positions were bought and sold, and the very idea of salvation was linked to the sale of indulgences. The voices of Huss, Zwingli, Luther and Calvin rose up against the libertine clergy, who loved riches and pleasure, and who allowed women of loose morals to enter convents where they adored a Venus at night and the Madonna in the morning. They hoped for a poor penitent church and denied the function of a priest as an intermediary between God and man. In 1532, at the field of Chanforan in Piedmont, the Waldensians agreed to support the Geneva Reform, a Calvinistic, theological doctrine. And after a time they began to practice their cult publicly. The Waldensians of Calabria, called Ultramontane, certain that they too could express their faith openly, sent the young Marco Eusegli to Geneva to ask for ministers to be sent to their region. In March 1559, he returned with 3 ministers: Giacomo Bonelli, Stefano Negrini and Gianluigi Pasquale, whose fiery sermons encouraged his followers to profess their own religion. Maybe it was in those days that a Waldensian temple was built in Guardia and subsequently demolished, leaving today only the little square. Owing to the complaints of the clergy, and in fear of an intervention from the Inquisition, Spinelli and the wealthy Waldensians counseled prudence, and invited Pasquale to tone down his sermons. However, on the 2nd of March 1559, Gianluca Pasquale was arrested together with Marco Eusegli and Stefano Negrini. Conducted to the prison in the castle of Fuscoldo, he was visited by several priests who hoped to convert him. On the 7th of May of that year he wrote these words: "I have been visited by 2 venerable priests, but when I begin a discussion with them, they excuse themselves for their ignorance and are unable to oppose my arguments."
The 3 prisoners were then interrogated by Monsignor Orazio Bacco, the vicar of Cardinal Taddeo Gaddi, the Archbishop of Cosenza, who recorded the statement of the accused and decided to send them to the court of Naples. Not only were the authorities of the Kingdom of Naples interested in the Pascal case, but also the Roman Inquisition, who had urged the Viceroy Pedro Alfanda Ibera, the first Duke of Alcala, the second Marquis of Tarifa, the sixth Count of Luz Morales, and former Viceroy of Catalonia, to take severe measures against the Waldensians of Guardia and of San Sisto. At the beginning of January 1560, Gianluigi Pascal, Marco Eusegli and Stefano Negrin were boarded on ship for Naples, but because of a storm at sea, the journey had to be postponed. They were then taken to Cosenza and enclosed in the prisons of the Archbishop's Curia, where Stefano Negrini died from the tortures he received. In February, the other two, Pascal and Eusegli, were moved to prisons in the castle and shut up in a dark ditch. There followed another interrogation. But even when tortured, the two Waldensians confirmed their faith. At this point it was decided to send them to Naples by land. Pascal wrote, "We set off by road on the 15th of April, together with 22 other prisoners condemned to the galleys. On the way we were subjected to great cruelty. The Spaniard, who conducted us, put on me a pair of handcuffs, which were so tight that they made my arms swell. The iron cut into my flesh and the pain was intolerable. I only managed to get him to loosen them when he emptied the 2 ducats from my bag, which had been left to me for my expenses." After a 9 days' walk, they reached Naples and were put in a very dark prison called the Criminal, in which everything dripped with humidity and the stench from the prisons was appalling. After 3 days, I was examined by a Dominican friar, who sent me to a prison, which was even worse than the first one. I stayed there until the 9th of May, on which day I was sent with Marco Eusegli, as though on show, to the bishop's palace and then to the jetty to set sail for Rome. But the sea was so rough that the guards were forced to send us back to the palace, where we are waiting for good weather to be sent to Rome. On the 15th of May 1560, they reached Rome by sea and were shut in the prison of Tordinona. However, we have uncertain information about this last period. It seems that Marco Eusegli was sentenced to death, but since his name appears in the list of refugees from Calabria in 1563, he probably escaped to Geneva. Instead, Gianluigi Pascal was first tortured, and then after the records were signed at Santa Maria sopra Minerva, he was burned at the stake on the 16th of September 1560. A document reports, Aloysius Pasquale, tortured with his accomplices, being a perfidious Lutheran, neither wished to confess or hear Mass, denying every divine holy teaching and insisting in his stubbornness. So on this 16 aforesaid day he was taken to the bridge of St. Angelo, where he was burnt. One can think that everything happened in the same way, in which 10 years later Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake, and of which we have the following testimony. At 6 o'clock at night, we were consigned the above-mentioned Giordano Giovanni Bruno, an apostate from Nola di Regno, condemned to death as an unrepentant heretic. He was exhorted by our brothers with great charity, and 2 fathers from San Domenico, 2 from the Gesù, 2 from the new church and 1 from San Giacomo were called, and who, teaching him with affection, showed him the error of his ways. But he continued in his cursed obstinacy, his brain and intellect filled with many errors and falseness. But he so persisted in his obstinacy, that he was taken from the ministers of justice to Campo di Fari, and then naked and tied to a stake he was burnt alive. It was the 17th of February 1600. large-scale sermons bore fruit, so that in November 1560, the Dominican brother Fulvio Malvicino, named Delegate Commissioner for the Holy Faith in Calabria, was sent to settle the Waldensian problem. He called the population to the public squares of San Sisto and Guardia, preached them a sermon, while they bent their heads and lowered their eyes. He watched to see anyone who made a false movement or threw a furtive glance. He would have begun his interrogation with that. He invited them to renounce and denounce, seeing that those who keep silent are more guilty than those who commit sins. And threatening that after terrible torture, they would suffer the flames of hell, he gave them 3 days in which to repent and convert. And further they were: 1. Forbidden to meet in groups larger than 6 people. 2. Forbidden to speak in their Provençal language. 3. Obliged to hear Mass before going to work. 4. Obliged to wear a habit after they had repented. 5. Obliged to go to confession and communion on all holy days of obligation. 6. Obliged to request preachers during Lent. 7. Forbidden to leave for Piedmont or Geneva. 8. Forbidden to write to heretics without permission from the Inquisition. 9. Forbidden to marry among themselves. 10. The houses, where Pascal had stayed at Guardia and Bonelli at San Sisto, were to be destroyed. They also tried to trick the inhabitants of Guardia, suggesting that they should abjure as their brothers in San Sisto had done. But when the people of Guardia found out that this news was false, and that in fact there had been an open rebellion at San Sisto, many of them escaped into the woods to join the exiles of San Sisto. The viceroy, governor of the region, intervened, ordering the Duke of Montalto to punish the rebels. A company of soldiers was gathered under the command of Baron Don Felipe Castagnito, governor of Montalto, who, together with the bishop, sent a letter to the fugitives, which guaranteed safety to the women and children, if they wanted to go back to the town. Following this, they began to search the woods, and discovering some fugitives, they ordered them to be exterminated. Then the rebels, who knew the mountains well, led the soldiers to a gorge, surrounded them and killed 50 of them, including Castagnito. was considered to be an armed revolt against the state. The rebels, accused of crimes against the faith and the crown, were considered to be the same as the bandits of the Sila Mountains, and in the same way were to be sought out and punished. A crusade was organized, commanded by Don Marino Caracciolo, the Marquis of Buccianico, into whose army even bandits condemned for murder and theft, and who had been promised a general amnesty, were conscripted. At the beginning of June 1561, San Sisto was raided and set fire to. Groups of women, who had returned to the town, trusting in the letters from the bishop and the authorities, which guaranteed their safety, were attacked, robbed and raped. Some of them were so cruelly tortured that the ropes, which tied them, cut into their flesh, causing injuries, which became infested with worms. Many were captured and killed after having been hunted down by mastiffs specially trained for the purpose of hunting men. Having destroyed the houses, cut down the vines and the orchards, the soldiers marched on to Guardia. Built on top of a hill and surrounded by a wall, made it impossible to be attacked openly as in San Sisto, so an infamous trap was plotted. Soldiers and false prisoners approached the gates of the town asking for hospitality on the orders of Prince Salvator Spinelli. The gullible inhabitants of Guardia agreed. When it was dark, the soldiers and the false prisoners opened the town gates, letting other soldiers, and the massacre began. The inhabitants, surprised in their sleep, were killed. Some had their throats cut, some were sawn in half, others were thrown down from a high cliff, while others were burnt over a slow fire. The town was set alight, and it is said that the blood running through the streets joined up into a single river, which flowed towards the entrance of the town once called Porta Grande and now known as Porta del Sang. To those who managed to escape and save themselves, a pardon was promised if they gave themselves up. But, as in San Sisto, these promises were not kept. Arrested, they walked in silence, many dragging their feet, and they were brought to the prisons of Montalto and Cosenza.
tutti arrestati e camminando in silenzio, molti trascinando i piedi, condotti alle carceri di Montalto e di Cosenza.
prisons had only one window, protected with bars, which only just let in the sunlight. At Montalto the men, from Guardia and San Sisto, were tortured from morning to night in 4 places in the castle, to make them confess quickly and abjure. Many of them died from hunger, cold and torture. For some a trial was set up, but, since a papal bull of Innocenzo III forbid the defense of heretics, who defends a heretic defends heresy, they were assigned a lawyer who, following an investigatory rather than an accusatory method, tried to get a spontaneous confession from the accused even using torture. Before they were massacred, the survivors were taken to confess in the church of St. Domenico and St. Francesco di Pola, which had been inaugurated 2 years previously. Shut up in a house near the church of St. Francesco, with memories that stopped them from sleeping. They prayed hoping for something unexpected to happen. Some of them sobbed quietly. Nobody dared disturb the anguish of the others. Nobody had the strength to help. In the silence of the night a voice was raised.
Our Father, who art in heaven. Others joined in, hallowed be thy name. And then everyone with one voice, thy will be done on earth, as it is in heaven. Amen.
Nel silenzio della notte si leva una voce. si uniscono. Sia santificato il tuo nome, e come in un crescendo tutti con una sola voce, sia fatta la tua volontà, come in cielo così in terra. Amen.
Dawn comes, the town, still deep in sleep, is woken by the crowing of a cockerel. Through the narrow windows, the condemned men see the marvelous sunrise for the last time, while the smoke from early morning fires rises from the roofs. They know that they must say farewell to the limpid morning air, to the breeze that caressed their faces, to the sky whose stars were vanishing in the light of the day. At dawn on the 11th of June 1561, on the steps of San Francesco di Pola, at Montalto, the slaughter begins. In a letter dated the 12th of June of the same year, and published in the Avicii of Naples, a sort of collection of events and news from all over Europe similar to a modern newspaper, an eyewitness, a Jesuit Father Xavier, addressing his provincial Father Samaron, writes,
"Up to now it has been written every day what has happened to these heretics. Now it is necessary to tell how today at an early hour a horrible justice was carried out on these Lutherans, which only to think about is frightening. That the death of these people is like a death of an animal, though where they were all locked up together in a house the executioner arrived and took them one by one. He tied them up with their eyes blindfolded and led them one by one to a large space near that house. Each one was made to kneel, his throat was cut with a knife, and then he was left like that. Then they took the bloodied blindfold, and with the blood-covered knife came back for the next one and did the same to him, continuing in the same way until there were 88. I leave it to you to imagine how pitiful this spectacle was. The old men went to their death joyfully, the young ones were afraid. Orders were given and the cartloads are already here. The bodies will be quartered and will be handed on along the road to the borders of Calabria. Justice has been done, and so harshly that not only the inhabitants of this land will be frightened, but everywhere the news reaches. Malvicino was present, and he continued to treat the women and children with ferocity. He never tired of beating, hitting, punching, kicking, and pulling out the hair of those poor wretches. The slaughter over, the news reported that maybe with the aim of further terrorizing or intimidating. Maybe to affirm a delirium of impunity and the desire for power, or perhaps simply to disfigure. The bodies of the 88 condemned men were in fact quartered and hung on poles along the road that goes from Cosenza to Murano Calabro. Their faces are disfigured, purple or almost black in color, their heads drooping to one side with their features contracted, their eyes popping out of their heads and their tongues hanging out of their open mouths. In Cosenza, in the square near the river Basento, today called Valdesai Square, more executions were held. The children and the orphans were sold as slaves or given over to various families to be brought up in the Catholic religion. Some of the women, instead, died in prison, others were sold for cash as slaves. No one ever knew what happened to the prettiest of them. On the 27th of June, 5 of the most heretical women, who were destined to be burnt at the stake, were coated in resin which caused the flames to consume them slowly so that they suffered more while they were punished for their impiety.
news of the atrocities in San Sisto and Guardia soon reached the frontiers of Italy. In the same year, publications and comments appeared in Europe, and especially in Germany. If at first the massacre was intended to intimidate and terrorize those who attempted to leave the Orthodox Catholic Church, the same hierarchy later wished that unhappy story could be buried in eternal oblivion. Now a heartfelt thought goes to those martyrs without names who lie at rest in Mother Earth, and to all those who today, in desperation, leave their loved ones, their homelands, and set out on a journey of hope, and who are often shipwrecked in the waves of our sea. Of the 88 martyrs of Montalto, I will only name Martino Anan, father and grandfather, his children Joanne and Michelle, Joanne, daughter of Michelle and granddaughter of Martino. 3 generations of the same family who died in one morning. Over the centuries, the Church of Rome seemed to have lost its evangelical message, and in proclaiming itself the only repository of the truth had favored the authority of power to the spiritual authority, which comes from Christ's message. The Second Vatican Council brought an end to much intolerance, and a new path was opened, dialogue with other faiths. And Pope Francis affirms, "We cannot resign ourselves to divisions in the distance that separation has produced among us." Group of dots. We have the possibility to overcome controversy and incomprehension, which have often prevented us from understanding one another. Today, with the new climate of ecumenism, there exists a perspective of hope for the building up of an open, synodal and above all humane church. Our greatest hope is that all Christian churches, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, will recognize each other as the Church of Christ, on the basis of the principle of unity within differences. Unity based not on the assimilation of one by another, but on the reciprocal recognition of their theological and spiritual differences. We therefore desire a meeting between the followers of different faiths and religions, and together to pray and to converse. Dialogues intended not to set forth doctrines, but to search for a common way to demonstrate the inconsistency of all doctrines when faced with the arcane mystery of life.
Oggi auspichiamo un incontro tra i fedeli di diversi culti, di diverse religioni, e insieme pregare e dialogare. Dialogo inteso non come manifestazione dottrinale, ma come ricerca di un cammino che faccia comprendere l'insufficienza di tutte le dottrine